Malcolm Harris gripped the red-hot iron in his powerful hands, the metal searing against his calloused palms as he shaped the very chains that would bind men like himself. But on this sultry Louisiana evening, those chains would serve a different purpose entirely. The overseer who had delighted in the crack of his whip was about to discover what it felt like to be powerless, to feel metal bite into flesh, to hear the grinding mechanical hunger of the sugar mill that had claimed so many lives. Malcolm had spent years watching, waiting, planning, and tonight, the roles would finally reverse in the most brutal way imaginable. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The year was 1857, and the Beaumont plantation stretched across 2,000 acres of Louisiana's fertile delta land. Its sprawling fields of sugarcane swaying in the humid breeze that carried the sweet scent of molasses and the bitter tang of human suffering. The plantation house, a grand columned mansion painted white as bone, stood like a monument to prosperity built upon the backs of 300 enslaved souls who toiled from dawn until darkness claimed the sky. Malcolm Harris was not like the other men who labored in those fields. Standing 6 feet 4 inches tall with shoulders broad as an oak tree's trunk, his dark skin bore the scars of countless burns from the forge where he spent his days crafting the tools of bondage. His hands, massive and scarred, could shape iron with the precision of an artist. Yet those same hands had never been allowed to write his own name or touch the face of his wife without permission from white men who claimed ownership over his very breath. The plantation's sugar mill stood at the heart of the operation, a monstrous machine of iron rollers and wooden gears that crushed the life from sugarcane stalks with mechanical indifference. It was here that the true horror of plantation life revealed itself most clearly. The mill's rollers, each weighing several tons, turned with relentless force, grinding anything caught between them into pulp. Over the years, Malcolm had witnessed dozens of men lose fingers, hands, entire arms to the hungry machine. Some had been pulled in completely, their screams cut short by the crushing weight of progress and profit. The mill operated from sunrise to sunset during harvest season, its rhythmic grinding serving as a hellish metronome that marked the passage of days filled with back-breaking labor. Workers fed stalks of cane into the mechanical beast, while others collected the extracted juice that would later be boiled down into the white crystals that graced the tables of wealthy families across America and Europe. The sweet product that emerged from this place of suffering seemed to mock the bitter reality of its creation. Malcolm's forge sat adjacent to the mill, close enough that he could hear every scream, every crack of bone, every wet sound that spoke of flesh meeting unstoppable force. His job was to maintain the equipment, to repair the very machine that devoured human lives with such casual hunger. Each morning he would examine the gears, oil the mechanisms, and ensure that the plantation's heart of darkness continued beating with mechanical precision. The overseer who ruled this domain of suffering was a man named Dwyer, a tall, lean figure whose pale skin seemed to have absorbed none of the warmth from years under the Louisiana sun. His gray eyes held a coldness that made even the most hardened field hands look away when he passed. Dwyer carried a bullwhip coiled at his side like a serpent, its leather braided tight and stained with the blood of countless backs that had felt its bite. Dwyer took particular pleasure in watching the mill operate during harvest season. He would stand near the feed mechanism, his thin lips curved in what might have been called a smile on a kinder face, watching as exhausted workers risked their limbs to keep the cane flowing. When someone moved too slowly or showed signs of fatigue, the whip would snake out with lightning speed, leaving fresh welts across shoulders and backs already crosshatched with scars from previous punishments. Malcolm had felt that whip more times than he cared to remember. His back was a road map of pain, each raised scar telling a story of Dwyer's cruelty. The overseer seemed to take special interest in the blacksmith, perhaps sensing something dangerous in the way Malcolm's dark eyes would follow his movements, or in the controlled power that radiated from the man's massive frame even when he stood perfectly still. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening in late September when the air hung thick with moisture and the promise of rain. Malcolm had been working late at the forge, repairing a broken gear from the mill when he heard the commotion from the main building. Through the open door of his workshop, he could see torchlight flickering and hear the sound of voices raised in anger and fear. Sarah, a young woman who worked in the plantation house, came running toward the forge, with tears streaming down her face and blood seeping through her torn dress. She was perhaps 19 years old, with gentle features and intelligent eyes that had somehow retained their spark despite years of degradation and abuse. Malcolm had known her since she was a child, had watched her grow up in the shadow of white men's appetites and cruelty. She collapsed at the entrance to his workshop, her whole body shaking with sobs that seemed to tear themselves from her very soul. Malcolm set down his hammer and moved toward her, his heart already knowing what his mind didn't want to accept. The blood on her dress, the tears in the fabric, the glazed look of shock in her eyes all told a story that had been repeated countless times on plantations across the South. Through broken whispers, Sarah told him what had happened. Dwyer had cornered her in the mansion's pantry, had forced himself upon her while the plantation owner's family slept peacefully in their beds upstairs. When she had tried to resist, he had struck her across the face with such force that it split her lip and sent her tumbling against the wooden shelves. The assault that followed was brutal and degrading, leaving her broken in ways that extended far beyond physical injury. As Malcolm listened to her story, something fundamental shifted inside his chest. The rage that he had been carrying for years, carefully contained and controlled, began to expand like molten metal heating in a furnace. His massive hands clenched into fists that could have pulverized stone, and for a moment, the careful mask of submission that he wore for survival slipped away completely. Sarah looked up at him with eyes that held no hope, only the dull acceptance of someone who had learned that justice was a luxury reserved for those with white skin and legal documents proving their humanity. She expected him to offer comfort, perhaps, or to help her clean her wounds and pretend that nothing had happened. She did not expect to see the cold calculation that was now spreading across his features like frost forming on a window pane. Malcolm helped her to her feet with gentle hands that belied the violence brewing in his heart. He gave her clean water to wash with and a spare shirt to replace her torn dress. As she cleaned herself, he moved about the forge with purposeful efficiency, selecting tools and materials with the care of a craftsman beginning an important project. From a wooden chest hidden beneath a pile of scrap iron, Malcolm retrieved several lengths of chain that he had been secretly forging over the past months. Unlike the standard shackles produced for the plantation, these chains were works of art in their own deadly way. Each link had been individually crafted and hardened, creating bonds that could hold a bull elephant without breaking. The metal had been treated with techniques he had learned from his father, who had been a blacksmith before him, methods passed down through generations of men who had shaped iron with skill born of necessity and desperation. Sarah watched him work, confusion replacing shock as she realized that he was not preparing to comfort her or to report the assault to authorities who would dismiss her claims without consideration. Instead, Malcolm was preparing for war, gathering weapons, and planning strategies with the methodical precision of a general before battle. The plan that formed in Malcolm's mind was both simple and sophisticated. He had spent years observing Dwyer's routines, learning when the overseer was most vulnerable, when he was alone and isolated from help. Every Tuesday evening, Dwyer would make a final inspection of the mill before retiring to his private cabin, a ritual of control that satisfied his need to assert dominance over both machinery and human property. Malcolm waited until midnight, when the plantation had settled into the rhythm of exhausted sleep that followed each day of forced labor. The moon was dark, hidden behind clouds that promised rain before morning. He moved through the shadows, with surprising stealth for such a large man, his bare feet making no sound on the packed earth as he approached Dwyer's cabin. The overseer's quarters were modest compared to the main house, but luxurious by the standards of those who served under his whip. The cabin contained a bed with clean sheets, a writing desk where Dwyer recorded punishments and production numbers, and a small personal library filled with books that Malcolm would never be allowed to read. A bottle of whiskey sat on the desk next to a half-finished letter to Dwyer's brother in Georgia, the liquid amber catching moonlight that filtered through the single window. Dwyer lay sleeping peacefully, his face relaxed in slumber, free from the cruel lines that marked it during waking hours. His whip hung coiled on a hook beside the bed, its leather surface gleaming with oil and embedded fragments of human skin that told stories of countless floggings. The sight of that weapon filled Malcolm with a rage so pure and focused that it threatened to overwhelm his carefully laid plans. Moving with practiced silence, Malcolm approached the bed where his tormentor lay vulnerable. The chains in his hands felt warm, almost alive with potential energy waiting to be released. He had rehearsed this moment in his mind countless times, had imagined every detail of how he would bind the man who had caused so much suffering. Dwyer woke as the cold metal touched his wrists, his gray eyes flying open in confusion and sudden fear. He opened his mouth to shout for help, but Malcolm's massive hand clamped down over his face with crushing force. The overseer's eyes went wide with terror as he recognized his attacker, understanding flooding through him along with the realization that his years of cruelty had finally found their reckoning. The chains that Malcolm wrapped around Dwyer's wrists and ankles were works of masterful craftsmanship, each link perfectly forged and hardened to resist even the most desperate attempts at escape. The metal bit into pale skin that had never known the kiss of shackles, leaving marks that would serve as grim reminders of the powerlessness that Dwyer had inflicted upon others for so many years. Malcolm dragged his captive from the cabin with ease, the overseer's struggles proving as ineffective against the blacksmith's strength as a child's tantrum against the force of a hurricane. Dwyer's muffled cries for help went unanswered in the darkness, swallowed by the night air that carried only the sound of insects and distant thunder promising storm. The sugar mill stood silent and ominous in the pre-dawn darkness, its mechanical components gleaming with oil that reflected starlight like watching eyes. The great rollers that had claimed so many lives waited patiently for their next feeding, their iron surfaces scarred and stained with the evidence of previous encounters with human flesh and bone. Malcolm secured Dwyer to the mill's framework with additional chains, positioning him so that the overseer could see exactly what fate awaited him. The terror in those gray eyes was absolute now, the cruel confidence that had defined Dwyer's character replaced by animal panic and desperate pleading. Through the gag that Malcolm had fashioned from torn cloth, the overseer's words came out as meaningless sounds that held no power to command or threaten. As dawn approached, Malcolm took his time explaining exactly what was about to happen. His voice remained calm and measured, describing the mechanical process by which the mill would transform Dwyer's body into something unrecognizable. He spoke of the sounds the machinery would make, of the time it would take, of how the other workers would find nothing but red-stained gears when they arrived for the morning shift. The psychological torment proved almost as devastating as the physical threat. Dwyer had spent his career using fear as a weapon, had delighted in watching others cower before him in helpless terror. Now he experienced that same helplessness, felt the crushing weight of absolute powerlessness that he had inflicted upon hundreds of enslaved people throughout his years of service. Malcolm lit several torches around the mill, their flickering light creating dancing shadows that transformed the familiar workplace into something resembling a chamber from hell itself. The warm glow illuminated the mechanical components with an almost supernatural quality, making the waiting rollers seem alive with hungry anticipation. The blacksmith's movements were deliberate and ritualistic as he prepared the mill for operation. He oiled the gears with the same care he had shown countless times before, checked the alignment of the crushing rollers, and tested the feed mechanism that would draw its victim inexorably toward destruction. Every action was performed with the precision of a craftsman who took pride in his work, even when that work involved the most terrible form of justice. As the sun began to rise over the Louisiana Delta, painting the sky in shades of red that seemed to prophesy the violence about to unfold, Malcolm positioned Dwyer at the mill's intake. The overseer's struggles against his chains had grown weaker as exhaustion and terror took their toll, but his eyes still blazed with desperate hope that someone would arrive to save him from the fate that awaited. The mill roared to life with a sound like thunder trapped in iron, its massive components grinding into motion with the inexorable power of industrial progress. The rollers began their deadly rotation, their scarred surfaces catching the morning light as they waited to receive their offering. Steam rose from the machinery as metal heated with friction, creating an atmosphere thick with the smell of oil and impending death. Malcolm's voice rose above the mechanical noise as he spoke his final words to the man who had tormented so many innocent people. He spoke of Sarah and her tears, of the countless backs scarred by Dwyer's whip, of children torn from their mothers and men worked to death in the service of white prosperity. Each word carried the weight of accumulated suffering, the voice of every person who had died under Dwyer's cruel supervision. The feeding mechanism engaged with a sound like breaking bones, its iron teeth designed to grip and pull whatever was placed within its mechanical embrace. Dwyer's screams, even muffled by his gag, rose above the mill's roar as he was drawn inexorably toward the waiting rollers. His struggles became frantic, animalistic, as the reality of his situation stripped away the last pretenses of civilized behavior. Malcolm watched with eyes that showed no mercy, no satisfaction, only the cold justice of natural law finally asserting itself over human cruelty. This was not revenge in any petty sense, but rather the restoration of balance to a world that had been twisted by generations of systematic brutality and dehumanization. The mill's rollers accepted their offering with mechanical indifference, iron meeting flesh with the same crushing force that had processed countless tons of sugarcane. The sound that emerged from the machinery changed in pitch and timbre, becoming something wet and organic that spoke of transformation beyond recognition. Steam and mist rose from the crushing chamber, carrying with it the metallic scent of blood and the ending of a life that had caused immeasurable suffering. When the terrible work was finished, Malcolm shut down the mill and stood in the sudden silence that followed. The mechanical monster had returned to its slumber, its hunger temporarily satisfied by the meal it had been fed. Red stains marked the rollers and gears, evidence of the justice that had been served in the pre-dawn darkness of a Louisiana morning. The blacksmith cleaned himself methodically, washing away the evidence of the night's work with water from the mill's cooling system. His movements were calm and purposeful, showing none of the frantic energy that might be expected from someone who had just committed what white law would certainly call murder. Instead, Malcolm displayed the quiet satisfaction of a craftsman who had completed a difficult but necessary project. As the plantation began to stir with the sounds of another day's labor, Malcolm made his final preparations for departure. He had known from the moment he began planning this act of justice that he could never remain on the plantation afterward. The discovery of Dwyer's fate would bring investigation, punishment, and almost certainly death for any enslaved person suspected of involvement. From his hidden cache of supplies, Malcolm retrieved a small bundle of personal possessions that he had been secretly preparing for months. The bundle contained tools of his trade, a few pieces of silver that he had managed to acquire through years of careful trading, and a hand-drawn map of the Louisiana swamplands that bordered the plantation's eastern boundary. The swamps represented both refuge and danger, a vast wilderness where a man could disappear completely, but where survival required skills that few possessed. Malcolm had been studying the waterways and hidden paths for years, learning from other escaped people who had briefly found shelter on the plantation before continuing their journey northward toward freedom. Before leaving, Malcolm made one final stop at the quarters where Sarah lived with several other houseworkers. The young woman was awake, sitting by her small window and staring out at the dawn sky, with eyes that held the hollow emptiness of someone whose faith in justice had been shattered. She turned when she heard his soft footsteps, and her expression changed as she saw the quiet resolution in his face. Without words, she understood what had happened and what it meant. Malcolm's presence radiated the calm that comes after a storm has passed, the peace that follows the completion of necessary but terrible work. Sarah rose from her seat and embraced him, her tears falling silently as she realized that his act of vengeance had also been an act of love, a declaration that her dignity and humanity mattered enough to risk everything. Malcolm pressed a small iron token into her hand, a piece he had crafted months earlier and inscribed with symbols that spoke of protection and remembrance. The metal was warm from his touch, carrying with it the promise that somewhere in the world there would always be someone who remembered her suffering and had acted to answer it with justice. As the plantation began to wake fully, with workers emerging from their quarters and moving toward another day of forced labor, Malcolm Harris vanished into the Louisiana wilderness, like smoke dissipating in morning air. Behind him, the sugar mill stood silent and stained, waiting for workers to discover the grisly evidence of the night's events. The discovery of Dwyer's remains sent shockwaves through the plantation community and beyond. The plantation owner, Richard Beaumont, arrived at the mill to find his overseer transformed into something barely recognizable as human. The mechanical precision of industrial machinery having erased the man who had terrorized so many people for so many years. Beaumont's rage was volcanic in its intensity, his screams of fury echoing across the plantation as he realized that one of his human property had dared to strike back against the system that granted him absolute power over their lives. He ordered every building searched, every person questioned, every possible hiding place examined with the thoroughness of a man whose fundamental worldview had been challenged by an act of rebellion he had never imagined possible. The investigation that followed was brutal and comprehensive. Beaumont brought in professional slave catchers, men whose expertise lay in tracking down escaped people and returning them to bondage. Dogs were brought in to follow scent trails, rewards were posted throughout the region, and a network of informants was activated to report any sighting of the fugitive Blacksmith. But Malcolm had vanished as completely as if the earth itself had swallowed him. The swamplands that bordered the plantation were vast and treacherous, filled with quicksand, poisonous snakes, and waterways that changed course with each seasonal flood. For someone who knew their secrets, they offered perfect concealment, but for the uninitiated, they represented death in a dozen different forms. Search parties ventured into the swamps for weeks, following false leads and phantom trails that led nowhere. Some searchers never returned, claimed by the wilderness or by other dangers that lurked in the murky waters. Others emerged days later, half-mad from exposure and terror, speaking of shadows that moved like men and sounds that suggested human presence but revealed nothing when investigated. The story of Malcolm's revenge spread through the enslaved communities of Louisiana like wildfire, carried by whispered conversations and coded psalms that celebrated justice finally served. Workers on plantations throughout the region began to look at their overseers with new eyes, seeing not invincible authorities but mortal men who could bleed and die like anyone else. The tale grew in the telling, becoming legend and inspiration for people who had been taught from birth that resistance was impossible and rebellion was suicide. Malcolm Harris became a symbol of possibility, proof that the system of bondage was not as unbreakable as their masters claimed. His name was spoken in hidden gatherings, carved into tree bark, and woven into songs that would survive long after the plantation system itself had crumbled. Months passed without any sign of the fugitive Blacksmith. Spring arrived with its promises of renewal, followed by summer's oppressive heat and the beginning of another harvest season. The sugar mill was repaired and put back into operation, its stained rollers cleaned and oiled as if nothing had ever happened within its mechanical embrace. But the plantation was forever changed by what had occurred that September night. Workers moved with a different energy, their backs straighter and their eyes more alert. Overseers found themselves looking over their shoulders, jumping at unexpected sounds, and sleeping less soundly in beds that no longer felt completely safe. New overseers came and went, none able to establish the same climate of absolute terror that Dwyer had maintained. Some were more humane, recognizing that brutality bred its own destruction. Others attempted to match or exceed Dwyer's cruelty, only to find themselves facing resistance that had not existed before Malcolm's act of justice. Sarah continued to work in the plantation house, but something fundamental had changed in her bearing. The broken spirit that had characterized her in the immediate aftermath of her assault was replaced by a quiet strength that seemed to draw power from the memory of that pre-dawn morning when justice had finally been served. She carried Malcolm's token with her always, a reminder that someone had cared enough to risk everything for her dignity. Meanwhile, deep in the Louisiana swamplands, Malcolm Harris had indeed found a form of freedom that his former masters could never understand or reclaim. The wilderness that had seemed so threatening to his pursuers became home to someone who approached it with respect rather than conquest, who learned its rhythms and adapted to its demands rather than trying to impose his will upon it. He built a shelter on a small island hidden among the cypress trees, constructing it from materials the swamp provided and techniques he had learned from other fugitives who had passed through the hidden network of safe places scattered throughout the wetlands. The shelter was invisible from any distance, blending so perfectly with its surroundings that even someone standing nearby might pass it without notice. Malcolm's skills as a blacksmith proved invaluable in his new life. Using scrap metal salvaged from abandoned equipment and techniques adapted to wilderness conditions, he created tools and weapons that enabled him to thrive in an environment where most people would quickly perish. His powerful hands that had once forged chains for other people now crafted instruments of survival and freedom. The swamp provided everything he needed for those who knew how to take it. Fish filled the waterways, birds nested in abundance among the trees, and plant life offered both food and medicine for someone educated in their properties. Malcolm learned to read the signs that warned of dangerous weather, to navigate by stars and water currents, and to move through the marsh without leaving traces that hunters could follow. Other fugitives occasionally found their way to his hidden refuge, guided by the same underground network that had helped him escape. Malcolm would shelter them, share his knowledge of survival techniques, and help them continue their journey toward whatever freedom they could find in a world that legally regarded them as property rather than people. Each person he helped represented another victory over the system that had tried to break his spirit and claim ownership of his humanity. Malcolm never asked about their stories or their crimes, understanding that survival in their world sometimes required actions that civilized society would condemn. He offered what assistance he could and sent them on their way with tools, supplies, and directions to the next safe haven along their difficult journey. Years passed in the swamplands, measured not by calendars, but by seasonal changes and the gradual accumulation of skills and knowledge that made life in the wilderness not just possible, but satisfying. Malcolm aged in his hidden refuge, his hair growing gray and his powerful frame becoming more weathered, but his spirit remained unbroken by the trauma of his past or the isolation of his present. News from the outside world occasionally reached him through the network of escaped people who passed through his territory. The war that had been brewing between North and South finally erupted into open conflict, turning the entire country into a battlefield, where the question of human bondage would finally be decided by force of arms, rather than legal compromise. Malcolm listened to reports of battles won and lost, of armies marching across landscapes he had once known, of plantations abandoned as their owners fled, advancing Union forces. The world that had created his suffering was tearing itself apart, consumed by contradictions that could no longer be contained within political boundaries or social conventions. When word came that the war had ended and that enslavement had been legally abolished throughout the former Confederate states, Malcolm felt a complex mixture of emotions. Joy at the liberation of millions of people was tempered by sorrow for all those who had not lived to see freedom, including countless individuals who had died under the whips of men like Dwyer. The knowledge that his act of justice had been part of a larger transformation gave deeper meaning to the violence he had committed that September night so many years earlier. He had struck a blow against a system that claimed moral authority while perpetrating the most fundamental violations of human dignity. History had vindicated his choice, even if the law of his time would have condemned it. Malcolm remained in the swamplands even after freedom came to Louisiana, finding that the wilderness had become more than refuge. It had become home. The skills he had developed, the peace he had found, the independence he had achieved, all represented forms of wealth that no legal document could grant or revoke. He had created a life entirely on his own terms, answerable to no authority except his own conscience and the natural laws that governed the world around him. Visitors sometimes found their way to his hidden sanctuary, former enslaved people who had heard stories of the blacksmith who had fed his overseer to the sugar mill and vanished into the swamps. They came seeking the man who had become legend, wanting to see for themselves the person who had dared to strike back against seemingly absolute power. Malcolm would welcome these visitors with quiet hospitality, sharing meals and stories around fires that cast dancing shadows among the ancient cypress trees. He spoke little of the night that had changed everything, preferring to focus on the life he had built afterward and the lessons he had learned about survival, dignity, and the price of freedom. Some visitors tried to convince him to leave the swamps and rejoin the world beyond the waterways, to use his story as inspiration for people still struggling with the legacy of bondage and the ongoing fight for true equality. But Malcolm had found something in the wilderness that civilization had never offered him: complete autonomy over his own existence, freedom from systems designed to exploit and control human beings for the benefit of others. As decades passed, Malcolm's story became part of the oral tradition that preserved the memory of resistance and rebellion throughout the South. Parents told their children about the blacksmith who had turned the master's tools against the master himself, who had fed oppression to the very machine that had symbolized industrial progress built on human suffering. The sugar mill on the Beaumont plantation was eventually dismantled and sold for scrap, its stained rollers and blood-marked gears scattered to foundries where they would be melted down and reformed into new machinery for a different era. But the memory of what had happened within its mechanical embrace remained, carried forward by people who understood that sometimes justice requires violence, that sometimes the only response to systematic cruelty, carefully planned revenge. Malcolm Harris lived out his remaining years in the Louisiana swamplands, dying peacefully in his hidden sanctuary at the age of 78. His body was laid to rest on the small island that had sheltered him for nearly 3 decades, buried beneath cypress trees, whose roots would eventually claim his bones and make them part of the eternal cycle of growth and renewal that governed the natural world. But his story lived on, passed down through generations of people who needed to believe that resistance was possible, that oppression would eventually face its reckoning, that somewhere in the world there were individuals willing to risk everything to defend human dignity against those who would destroy it for profit or pleasure. The tale of Malcolm of Louisiana became more than history, it became mythology, a reminder that even in humanity's darkest hours, there are those who refuse to accept injustice as inevitable. His hammer may have fallen silent, his forge may have grown cold, but the example he set continues to inspire people facing their own battles against systems designed to break human spirits and reduce human beings to commodities in someone else's balance sheet. In the end, Malcolm Harris achieved something that few people ever manage. He lived entirely on his own terms, answerable only to his own moral code, free from the compromises and corruptions that civilization demands of its participants. His violence had purpose, his justice had meaning, and his freedom was complete in ways that legal documents could never guarantee. The sugar mill that claimed Samuel Dwyer's life was eventually forgotten, just another piece of industrial equipment in humanity's long march toward mechanized progress. But the man who fed that mill its final meal became immortal. His name spoken wherever people gather to remember that oppression always carries within itself the seeds of its own destruction, and that justice, however delayed, however violent, however costly, will eventually find its way to those who have spent their lives denying it to others. Years after Malcolm's death, researchers and historians began to piece together the true scope of his influence on the Underground Railroad network that had operated throughout the Louisiana bayous. Documents discovered in hidden caches revealed that his swampland refuge had served as a crucial way station for hundreds of freedom seekers, making it one of the most significant safe houses in the entire South during the final decades before emancipation. The detailed maps that Malcolm had drawn of safe passages through the treacherous wetlands were found preserved in waterproof containers, their careful notations revealing escape routes that had saved countless lives. His knowledge of tides, seasonal flooding patterns, and wildlife behavior had been meticulously recorded and shared with other conductors in the network, creating a comprehensive guide to survival in terrain that had swallowed whole search parties sent to capture fugitive slaves. Archeological excavations of his island sanctuary uncovered evidence of sophisticated metalworking operations that had continued throughout his exile. Malcolm had not simply survived in the wilderness, he had thrived, creating tools and weapons that had armed other escapees and establishing a forge that operated in complete secrecy for nearly 3 decades. The quality of the artifacts discovered suggested that his skills had only improved during his years of isolation, refined by necessity and perfected through constant practice. Among the most remarkable discoveries were intricate iron sculptures that Malcolm had created during his solitary years, works of art that transformed the crude materials of his former bondage into expressions of passion, beauty, and defiance. These pieces, some standing over 6 feet tall, depicted scenes of liberation and triumph that spoke to an artistic vision that had found its voice only after he achieved true freedom. The sculptures had been carefully hidden, protected from the elements, and arranged in patterns that suggested they held spiritual or ceremonial significance for their creator. Local folklore, from the Cajun communities that lived on the edges of the Great Swamp, contained numerous references to a mysterious figure known as the Iron Ghost, a powerful spirit who protected travelers and punished those who brought harm to the innocent. The timing and location of these stories corresponded perfectly with Malcolm's known whereabouts, suggesting that his reputation had spread even among populations that had never known his true identity or the circumstances that had driven him into exile. Children in these communities were told stories of a giant who lived among the cypress trees, who could shape metal with his bare hands, and whose anger could summon mechanical demons to devour the wicked. Parents used these tales to teach lessons about justice and consequence, never knowing that their folklore was based on real events that had occurred just miles from their own homes. The influence of Malcolm's story extended far beyond Louisiana's borders, as news of his rebellion spread through the networks of communication that connected enslaved communities across the South. Blacksmiths on plantations from Virginia to Texas began incorporating subtle symbols into their work, small marks and designs that proclaimed solidarity with the man who had used his skills to strike back against opera, the system that oppressed them all. Some of these craftsmen began deliberately weakening the chains and shackles they were forced to create, introducing flaws that would cause the restraints to fail at crucial moments during escape attempts. Others used their positions to gather intelligence about slave patrol routes and safe houses, becoming crucial links in the Underground Railroad network that helped thousands reach freedom in the North. The psychological impact of Malcolm's revenge proved as significant as its immediate physical consequences. Overseers throughout the region found themselves facing enslaved populations that no longer regarded them as invincible authorities. The myth of white supremacy had been shattered by the image of Roderick Dwyer's broken body, feeding the very machine that had symbolized the plantation system's mechanical indifference to human suffering. Plantation owners responded to this challenge with increased violence and surveillance, but their efforts only served to further radicalize populations that had already begun to question the legitimacy of their bondage. The more brutal the repression became, the more appealing Malcolm's example appeared to people who had been taught from birth that resistance was futile and submission was their only option for survival. The economic disruption caused by these changing attitudes was substantial and measurable. Productivity declined on plantations throughout Louisiana as workers engaged in subtle forms of sabotage and resistance. Equipment broke down more frequently, harvests were delayed by mysterious accidents, and the careful calculations that made slavery profitable began to shift in favor of those who had previously been counted only as assets in someone else's ledger. Insurance companies began requiring higher premiums for plantation operations, recognizing that the risk of violent rebellion had increased significantly since the night Malcolm Harris fed his overseer to the Supere sugar mill. Some investors withdrew their capital entirely, preferring the relative safety of northern industrial ventures to the increasingly unstable world of southern agriculture. The ripple effects of one man's act of vengeance spread through the economy like cracks in a foundation, weakening the financial structures that supported the entire system of human bondage. While historians would later debate the exact contribution of Malcolm's rebellion to the eventual collapse of slavery, there was no question that his example had inspired countless others to resist in ways both larger and small. In the final analysis, Malcolm Harris had achieved something that no amount of legal argumentation or moral persuasion had been able to accomplish. He had demonstrated in the most visceral possible way that the relationship between master and slave was not ordained by divine will or natural law, but was instead a human construct that could be challenged, resisted, and ultimately destroyed by those with sufficient courage and determination. His legacy lived on not just in the stories told about him, but in the changed consciousness of everyone who heard those stories. The image of chains being turned against their creators, of industrial machinery consuming those who had used it to consume others, became a powerful metaphor for the revolutionary potential that lay dormant within Payar. Every system of oppression, Malcolm's hammered iron had shaped more than tools and weapons. It had forged a new understanding of what was possible when human beings refused to accept injustice as inevitable. His fire had burned away the illusions that sustained slavery, revealing the fundamental truth that oppression could only continue as long as its victims believed themselves powerless to resist. The swamplands that had sheltered him eventually returned to their natural state, but they retained an aura of sanctuary that drew freedom seekers for generations. Even after the Underground Railroad was no longer needed, people continued to visit the hidden waterways where Malcolm had found his refuge, seeking inspiration from the place where one man had proven that true freedom was worth any sacrifice required to achieve it. The transformation of Malcolm's story from historical fact to enduring legend accelerated during the tumultuous years of Reconstruction, when former enslaved people struggled to define their place in a society that had legally freed them but remained fundamentally hostile to their aspirations for true equality. In the face of rising violence from groups like the Ku Klux Klan and the systematic disenfranchisement that would later be codified in Jim Crow laws, Malcolm's example provided a powerful reminder that resistance had always been possible, even under the most oppressive circumstances. Churches throughout the South began incorporating references to Malcolm's story into their sermons, with preachers drawing parallels between his journey from bondage to freedom and the biblical narratives of exodus and liberation that had sustained their congregations through centuries of suffering. The image of chains being transformed from instruments of oppression into tools of justice resonated deeply with communities that were discovering their own power to reshape the world around them through collective action and unwavering determination. The industrial symbolism of Malcolm's revenge proved particularly potent during the rapid mechanization that followed the Civil War. As former agricultural workers moved into factories and mills throughout the South, they carried with them stories of the blacksmith who had turned the master's machinery against the master himself. These tales took on new meaning in environments where workers faced different forms of exploitation, reminding them that the tools of their oppression could also become the instruments of their liberation. Labor organizers in the late 19th and early 20th centuries often invoked Malcolm's name when rallying workers to resist unsafe conditions and unfair wages. The image of the sugar mill consuming its overseer became a metaphor for the potential consequences of treating human beings as expendable components in industrial processes designed to maximize profit, without regard for human dignity or safety. Strike leaders would tell Malcolm's story around campfires and in union halls, emphasizing how one man's refusal to accept injustice had inspired countless others to resist systems that treated them as less than brass. Human. The tale served as both warning to those in power and encouragement to those who felt powerless, demonstrating that even the most entrenched systems of oppression contained within themselves the seeds of their own destruction. Academic historians initially dismissed Malcolm's story as folklore rather than fact, arguing that the detailed accounts of his rebellion and subsequent life in the swamps were too dramatic to be credible. This skepticism reflected broader patterns of historical scholarship that marginalized narratives of resistance in favor of accounts that emphasized the paternalistic relationships between enslavers and the Sefer, enslaved, portraying slavery as a benevolent institution that had civilized supposedly primitive peoples. However, as civil rights activists in the 20th century began demanding more accurate representations of African American history, researchers started taking seriously the oral traditions that had preserved stories like Malcolm's for generations. Archeological expeditions to the Louisiana bayous uncovered physical evidence that corroborated many details of the accounts that had been passed down through families and communities for over a century. The discovery of Malcolm's forge and workshop revealed sophisticated metalworking techniques that challenged assumptions about the technological capabilities of enslaved craftsmen. Analysis of the tools and weapons found at the site demonstrated levels of skill and innovation that rivaled the work of free artisans in major cities, suggesting that the suppression of enslaved people's intellectual and creative potential represented an enormous waste of human resources that had weakened the entire Southern economy. Carbon dating of organic materials found in the refuge confirmed that the site had been continuously occupied during the period when Malcolm was believed to have lived there, while geological analysis of iron artifacts revealed ore sources that could only have been accessed through an extensive network of contacts and collaborators. The evidence painted a picture of a man who had not simply survived in isolation, but had maintained connections with the outside world, and continued to contribute to the broader struggle for freedom throughout his years in Barras. Exile. The sophistication of Malcolm's operation raised important questions about the extent of resistance networks that had operated largely in secret during the antebellum period. If one individual had been able to establish such an elaborate refuge and continue his work as both craftsman and conductor on the Underground Railroad, how many similar operations had existed without Crow, leaving traces in the historical record? The implications suggested that the scope of resistance to slavery had been far greater than previously understood, challenging narratives that portrayed most enslaved people as passive victims rather than active agents in their own liberation. Modern forensic analysis of the Beaumont plantation records revealed additional details about the aftermath of Dwyer's death that had been suppressed or distorted in contemporary accounts. Insurance claims filed by Richard Beaumont described property damage that extended far beyond the sugar mill itself, including fires that had destroyed several outbuildings and equipment failures that had disrupted operations for months following Malcolm's escape. The pattern of sabotage suggested that Malcolm had not acted alone, but had been part of a coordinated effort involving multiple individuals who had remained on the plantation after his departure. This discovery forced historians to reconsider their understanding of slave resistance, recognizing that successful rebellions often involved careful planning and broad networks of support rather than spontaneous acts of individual desperation. DNA analysis of remains found in unmarked graves near the plantation revealed evidence of violent deaths that had occurred in the months following Malcolm's rebellion, suggesting that Beaumont's investigation had been far more brutal than official records indicated. The discovery of multiple individuals who had died from injuries consistent with torture and execution provided grim testimony to the lengths that enslavers would go to maintain control over populations that, quote, had begun to question their authority. These findings added new dimensions to Malcolm's story, transforming it from a tale of individual revenge into an account of collective resistance that had claimed multiple lives, but had also demonstrated the vulnerability of the entire system of slavery. The knowledge that others had died for their connection to Malcolm's rebellion only enhanced his legendary status, proving that his example had inspired sacrifices that extended far beyond his own dramatic escape from bondage. The influence of Malcolm's story extended into the realm of literature and popular culture, inspiring novels, poems, and songs that kept his memory alive in new forms for successive generations. Writers of the Harlem Renaissance drew upon his example when crafting narratives of resistance and self-determination, using his journey from enslaved blacksmith to freeman as a template for stories that explored themes of dignity, justice, and the transformative power of righteous anger. Musicians incorporated elements of Malcolm's story into blues and gospel songs that spread throughout African American communities in the early 20th century. The rhythmic pounding of his hammer became a metaphor for the heartbeat of resistance, while the grinding of the sugar mill provided percussion for songs that celebrated the triumph of justice over oppression. These musical tributes ensured that Malcolm's story reached audiences who might never encounter it in written form, embedding his legacy in the cultural DNA of communities that continued to face discrimination and violence decades after slavery's legal abolition. Visual artists found inspiration in the dramatic imagery of Malcolm's rebellion, creating paintings and sculptures that depicted key moments from his story with power and emotional intensity. The contrast between the massive, powerful figure of the blacksmith and the mechanical precision of the mill that consumed his tormentor provided rich material for works that explored themes of humanity versus machinery, individual agency versus systematic oppression, and the costs and benefits of violent resistance to injustice. The psychological impact of Malcolm's story proved particularly significant for young people growing up in the Jim Crow South, where legal segregation and economic discrimination created new forms of bondage that differed from slavery primarily in their technical details rather than their fundamental character. Children who heard tales of the blacksmith who had refused to accept his fate carried those stories with them as they encountered their own challenges, drawing strength from the knowledge that resistance was both possible and potentially successful. Educational institutions and African American communities began incorporating Malcolm's story into their curricula, using his example to teach lessons about history, ethics, and the importance of standing up for one's principles regardless of the personal costs involved. Teachers found that students responded powerfully to narratives that portrayed their ancestors as active agents rather than passive victims, helping to counter the negative stereotypes and self-doubt that racist propaganda had been designed to instill. The international dimensions of Malcolm's influence became apparent as his story spread beyond American borders through networks of abolitionists and human rights activists who recognized its universal relevance to struggles against oppression. Translations of accounts of his rebellion appeared in multiple languages, inspiring resistance movements in colonial territories where indigenous peoples faced similar systems of exploitation and dehumanization. Revolutionary leaders in Haiti, Cuba, and other Caribbean islands that had experienced slavery drew explicit parallels between Malcolm's rebellion and their own efforts to overthrow colonial rule and establish independent nations based on principles of equality and human dignity. The image of the oppressed, using the master's tools against the master himself, became a central metaphor in liberation movements that sought to transform societies built on exploitation into communities based on justice and mutual respect. Anti-colonial activists in Africa and Asia similarly found inspiration in Malcolm's example, recognizing that his story contained lessons that transcended the specific historical context of American slavery. The fundamental principle that oppression could be successfully resisted by those with sufficient courage and determination resonated with people facing imperial domination, economic exploitation, and cultural suppression in contexts far removed from the Louisiana bayous where Malcolm had found his freedom. The technological aspects of Malcolm's story took on new significance during the Industrial Revolution and beyond, as mechanization transformed labor relations and created new forms of alienation between workers and the products of their efforts. The image of the sugar mill as a mechanical monster that consumed human flesh became a powerful metaphor for industrial processes that treated workers as expendable inputs rather than valuable human beings deserving of dignity and respect. Social critics and labor theorists used Malcolm's rebellion to illustrate the dangers of reducing human beings to mere components in economic systems designed to maximize efficiency and profit without regard for human welfare. The grinding rollers that had claimed so many lives during the plantation era found modern equivalents in factory machinery that maimed and killed workers who lacked adequate safety protections or legal recourse when injured on the job. Environmental activists of the late 20th and early 21st centuries discovered new relevance in Malcolm's story as they struggled to resist industrial development that threatened natural ecosystems. Indigenous communities, the Louisiana swamplands that had provided Malcolm with refuge, became symbols of the importance of preserving wild spaces that could serve as sanctuaries for those seeking alternatives to the destructive patterns of modern civilization. The intersection of environmental justice and social justice movements found powerful expression in accounts of Malcolm's life in the bayous, where he had achieved a form of sustainability that modern industrial society had abandoned in its pursuit of endless growth and consumption. His ability to live in harmony with natural systems while maintaining his dignity and independence provided a model for communities seeking to resist the environmental destruction that accompanied corporate exploitation of both human and natural resources. Climate change activists pointed to the Louisiana wetlands as examples of ecosystems that were disappearing due to industrial development and rising sea levels, arguing that the destruction of Malcolm's refuge represented a broader pattern of environmental racism that disproportionately affected communities of color. The loss of these natural sanctuaries eliminated options for resistance and self-sufficiency that had been available to previous generations, making modern forms of oppression more difficult to escape. The spiritual dimensions of Malcolm's story continued to evolve as new religious and philosophical movements discovered meaning in his journey from bondage to freedom. New Age spiritualists found inspiration in his connection to natural systems and his ability to transform anger into productive action, while traditional African religious practitioners recognized elements of ancestral wisdom in his use of ironworking as both practical skill and spiritual practice. Buddhist and Hindu teachers used Malcolm's story to illustrate concepts of karma and the inevitable consequences of actions, pointing to Dwyer's fate as an example of how oppressive behavior ultimately rebounds upon those who practice it. The mechanical precision with which the sugar mill had transformed the overseer's cruelty into his own destruction provided a powerful metaphor for natural laws that govern human behavior regardless of artificial social hierarchies or legal systems. Indigenous spiritual leaders found parallels between Malcolm's exile in the swamplands and traditional practices of seeking vision and wisdom through solitude and natural settings. His transformation from angry young man seeking revenge into wise elder providing guidance to other freedom seekers reflected spiritual journeys that were common in many Native American traditions, suggesting universal patterns of growth and development that transcended cultural boundaries. The legal implications of Malcolm's story continued to be debated by scholars and practitioners interested in questions of justified resistance to unjust authority. His case provided a dramatic example of situations where legal systems had been so corrupted by systematic oppression that violence might be the only available remedy for fundamental injustices that could not be addressed through conventional political or judicial processes. Constitutional law professors used Malcolm's rebellion to explore the relationship between legal obligation and moral duty, asking whether individuals had rights or even responsibilities to resist laws and institutions that violated basic principles of human dignity and equality. The dramatic nature of his response to Dwyer's cruelty forced students to confront difficult questions about the limits of nonviolent resistance and the circumstances under which violent action might be morally justified. International human rights law drew upon examples like Malcolm's story when developing frameworks for protecting individual conscience and resistance to state-sponsored oppression. The principle that individuals should not be required to cooperate with systems that dehumanize them or others found expression in treaties and declarations that recognized rights of resistance to genocide, slavery, and other crimes against humanity. The psychological trauma associated with systematic oppression became better understood through studies that examined the long-term effects of slavery on both individuals and communities. Malcolm's story provided insights into the ways that violence and dehumanization could damage human psyches while also revealing the resilience and adaptive capacity that enabled some individuals to survive and even thrive despite experiencing extreme trauma. Mental health professionals recognized that Malcolm's ability to channel his anger into productive action represented a form of post-traumatic growth that could serve as a model for others struggling to overcome experiences of abuse and oppression. His transformation from victim to agent of justice demonstrated that even the most severe psychological injuries could potentially be healed through actions that restored dignity and purpose to damaged lives. The therapeutic value of Malcolm's story extended to communities and populations that had experienced collective trauma through historical injustices such as slavery, genocide, and systematic discrimination. The knowledge that their ancestors had resisted oppression and achieved forms of liberation provided healing for people whose sense of identity and self-worth had been damaged by generations of negative stereotypes and institutional racism. Educational psychologists found that students responded powerfully to narratives that portrayed members of their own communities as heroes rather than victims, leading to improved academic performance and stronger cultural identity among young people who had previously internalized negative messages about their heritage and capabilities. Malcolm's example provided concrete evidence that intelligence, creativity, and moral courage were not limited to members of dominant groups, but were distributed throughout all human populations, regardless of race, class, or historical circumstances. The economic analysis of Malcolm's rebellion revealed the hidden costs of maintaining systems of oppression that required constant surveillance, violence, and control to prevent resistance and rebellion. The resources that plantation owners devoted to slave patrols, bounty hunters, and punishment systems represented significant drains on their productivity and profitability, suggesting that slavery was ultimately an inefficient economic system that survived primarily because of political and cultural factors rather than purely financial considerations. Modern economists used Malcolm's story to illustrate the concept of externalized costs, pointing out that the apparent profitability of slavery depended on ignoring the human suffering and social disruption that the system created. When these hidden costs were factored into calculations of economic efficiency, the case for slavery became much less compelling even from purely financial perspectives that ignored moral and ethical considerations. The ripple effects of individual acts of resistance like Malcolm's rebellion demonstrated how seemingly isolated incidents could have far-reaching consequences that undermined entire systems of oppression. The fear and uncertainty that his escape created among plantation owners throughout the region required them to invest additional resources in security measures that reduced their competitive advantages and made their operations more vulnerable to economic downturns and political changes. Labor economists found lessons in Malcolm's story about the importance of worker agency and the dangers of treating human beings as replaceable inputs in production processes. The skills and knowledge that he had developed as a blacksmith represented significant investments in human capital that were lost when he was forced to flee, illustrating the waste and inefficiency that resulted from systems that failed to recognize and reward individual talents and contributions. The technological innovations that Malcolm developed during his exile in the swamplands demonstrated the creative potential that was suppressed under slavery, but flourished when individuals were free to pursue their own interests and apply their skills to solving problems that they considered important. His achievements in metallurgy and engineering suggested that the Southern economy had been significantly weakened by its failure to utilize the full intellectual resources of its enslaved population. Contemporary relevance of Malcolm's story emerged in discussions of modern forms of trafficking, exploitation, and systematic oppression that continued to affect vulnerable populations around the world. Human rights activists found parallels between the plantation system that had trapped Malcolm and contemporary practices such as debt bondage, sex trafficking, and exploitative labor arrangements that reduced human beings to commodities in global economic systems. The principles of resistance and self-liberation that Malcolm had embodied provided guidance for modern anti-trafficking efforts that emphasized empowering victims to become agents of their own rescue, rather than passive recipients of assistance from external authorities. His example demonstrated that even the most oppressed individuals possessed capabilities and knowledge that could be mobilized to resist their exploitation if they were provided with appropriate support and opportunities. Prison reform activists drew upon Malcolm's story when critiquing criminal justice systems that disproportionately affected communities of color and perpetuated cycles of poverty and discrimination that resembled historical patterns of racial oppression. The Louisiana prison system, which was built partially on the site of former plantations and continued to exploit primarily African American labor for the benefit of private corporations, provided stark evidence that the legacy of slavery had not been fully addressed by legal emancipation alone. The symbolism of chains and shackles that featured prominently in Malcolm's story took on new meaning in discussions of mass incarceration and the school-to-prison pipeline that channeled young people of color away from educational opportunities and into correctional facilities where they provided cheap labor for private companies. Modern reformers used Malcolm's example to argue for fundamental changes in approaches to criminal justice that emphasized rehabilitation and restoration rather than punishment and exploitation. Immigration rights activists found inspiration in Malcolm's journey from bondage to freedom when advocating for policies that recognized the humanity and dignity of undocumented workers and refugees who faced deportation and family separation. The Underground Railroad networks that had helped Malcolm and others escape slavery provided historical precedents for contemporary sanctuary movements that offered protection to vulnerable immigrants, regardless of their legal status. The courage and sacrifice that Malcolm had demonstrated in his resistance to oppression served as a model for modern activists who faced imprisonment, violence, and other forms of retaliation for their efforts to protect marginalized communities and challenge unjust policies. His story reminded them that the struggle for justice had always required individuals willing to risk everything for principles that transcended personal safety and comfort. The global dimensions of Malcolm's influence continued to expand as his story was translated into new languages and adapted for different cultural contexts by activists and educators around the world. His example of successful resistance to systematic oppression resonated with people facing various forms of discrimination and exploitation, providing hope and practical guidance for those seeking to create more just and equitable societies. The enduring power of Malcolm's story lay not in its specific historical details, but in its demonstration of fundamental human capacities for resistance, creativity, and transformation that no system of oppression could completely suppress. His hammer had shaped more than iron. It had forged new possibilities for human freedom that continued to inspire people seeking liberation from various forms of bondage centuries after his death. In the end, Malcolm Harris had achieved true immortality, not through monuments or official histories, but through the countless lives that were changed by the knowledge that one man's refusal to accept injustice had proven that freedom was always possible for those with sufficient courage to claim it.